Also running from here is the broad-gauge Lalgola branch, caught by the camera with an old HPS still in charge. With all connections made, the narrow-gauge train then clattered off to its terminus at Nabadwip Gut on the banks of the Ganges. A railway journey in India wouldn't be complete without a visit to the Delhi Railway Museum, which counts among its treasures the unique Patiala State Monorail. Dating from 1908, it's a hybrid machine looking like a railway locomotive on one side and a traction engine on the other. The idea was to avoid the need to maintain the gauge of the track by having just a single rail and a road wheel to balance. It was grandly called the Ewing Patent Monorail System, but it didn't really work. The problem lay with the path for the road wheel. The Patialans did not have the benefit of the smooth concrete strip laid down 60 years later at the museum. The original surface kept breaking up, causing excessive vibration and damaging both the trains and the track. 4 of these little white elephants were built by the Orenstein and Koppel Company in Berlin, but they only lasted 5 years, being abandoned in 1913. 50 years later, this one was discovered intact, still stored in its shed at Patiala, and its reappearance, duly restored at the Delhi Museum, is a rare treat for the visitor. To track down some of the more interesting steam survivors, we shall travel south into the Deccan Peninsula, calling first at Goa on the west coast. This area has a different atmosphere from the rest of India. It used to be a Portuguese colony, not becoming part of modern India until 1961. The former masters of this coastal enclave left many architectural relics behind them, including a ceremonial archway for the governor's processions, and churches and abbeys in profusion, of which the ruined 140-foot high tower of St. Augustine is a good example. Today, Goa is a fast-developing tourist resort, best known for its fine tropical beaches. Some of the towns still bear their Portuguese names, and the former West of India Portuguese Railway is still there too. The British used to operate the line on behalf of the Portuguese, treating it as a branch of the meter-gauge Madras Southern system, and of course the locomotives were British as well. The Vulcan foundry at Newton-le-Willows made regular deliveries of these YD Class 282s from 1928 onwards, and this was the final batch, sent out in 1949. They too were colonial classics, like the broad-gauge HPS locos from the same builder we saw in Calcutta, and proved their worth by the number of times they were reordered. The Vulcan foundry was one of several manufacturers enjoying a brief boom in the late 40s and early 50s, as overseas railway systems renewed their steam locomotive stock to make up for wartime losses. It was just like the old days, with rows of brand new engines lined up on the quayside for shipment to the colonies. It was hard to believe that the British Empire was coming to an end. This last shipment of YDs took place 2 years after the British had left India. On the Goa Railway today, most of the traffic is now diesel-hauled, both freight and passenger. But the YDs are still used as banking engines on the Ghat, or mountain section, up to Castle Rock, where the friendly engine drivers welcome you aboard for a ride in the cab that makes up in scenic interest for what it lacks in comfort. coastal area still sees steam haulage on some local passenger trains. This is another YD on the morning train from Colomb to Vasco da Gama. Some of Goa's beach resorts are served by the railway, the best example being Majorda, which is only half a mile from the station. A ride on a vintage steam train is even promoted as a local excursion by tour operators catering to the increased numbers of package deal holidaymakers who fly in direct from Europe. The popularity of these trains with overseas tourists may lead the authorities to reconsider their announced intention to abolish steam in Goa by 1990. From the palm trees and tropical heat of the west coast, we now make our way to the perpetual spring of the hill station at Uttakamund in southern India, affectionately known as Ooty. The traveller from Madras leaves the broad gauge of the Mettupalayam railhead on the edge of the dusty southern plains. From here, it's 29 miles to Ooty by a meter gauge line winding up through tea plantations with English names in a range of hills called the Nilgiris, which means the Blue Mountains. Each morning at dawn, the locomotive for the daily passenger train is steamed up in Mettupalayam. The men in the yard attend to the needs of the Nilgiri Queen, while the coal heavers carry their burdens to her with a dignity that only an Indian would bring to such a humble task. The station slowly comes to life for the morning departure. An English clock reminds us there's just time left to get some reading matter for the journey, courtesy of Mr. Higginbottom. At 7:50 precisely, the whistle blows and the train leaves, with the inevitable joyriders leaping aboard at the last minute. Salah is the first of several leisurely stops on the journey, and the last station on the plain before the serious business of climbing the Nilgiri hills begins. The reason for putting the engine at the back of the train now becomes apparent. It's to prevent the possibility of a carriage breaking loose and running away on the steep gradient, which has now reached a pitch of 1 in 12.5. A rack rail now appears in the center of the track in the manner of a Swiss mountain railway. The locomotive would not have sufficient grip with just ordinary wheels on such a steep grade, so a large cogwheel is hidden between the wheels to grip on the teeth of the rack rail and prevent the engine slipping. Some of the stations still bear the names of the English tea plantations they once served. The main reason for stopping these days, however, is for passengers to stretch their legs and the crew to service the locomotive. With the engine conveniently placed at the rear of the train, passengers in the front have an unimpeded view of tunnels and rock galleries, revealing an endless succession of scenic vistas, gaining in splendor as the train climbs higher into the Blue Mountains. Another stop for water, this time at Runnymede. At Glendale, the train crosses a viaduct over a tea plantation before attacking the last 3 miles of the climb to Cunor. It's one of the most photogenic spots on the line, and it takes 3 visits to cover all the angles on a train that only runs once a day for most of the year. 91 Bagirata gives a fine display of the rack and pinion drive in action. The Nilgiri Express has an average speed of 6¼ miles per hour and has the distinction of being India's slowest train. After a journey time of 2 hours and 50 minutes, the train arrives at Coonoor, having covered just 17½ miles. Coonoor is a small market town squeezed into a narrow valley by steep hills and centre of the Nilgiri tea trade, where bullock carts still take the traditional tea chest on the first stage of its long journey to the English tea table. All Saints' Church, Coonoor, guards the souls of generations of plantation owners and officers of the Raj. Only the monkeys in the trees distinguish the scene from Leatherhead or Tunbridge Wells. The writer James Cameron described the Nilgiris as an exotic version of Sussex. Back in the town centre, the bus from Mettupalayam has now caught up. But fortunately, there are enough people anxious to avoid the hairpin bends on the mountain road to keep the train in business. The locomotive that has laboured up the rack from the plains is on this occasion number 84, the oldest one on the line, dating from 1914. The Ooty engines are all of the same type, X-Class 082 tank engines, designed for the rack by the Swiss Locomotive and Machine Company and built at their Winterthur works. By a coincidence, the engine taking over for the last 11 miles to Ooty is the newest one on the line, number 95, built as recently as 1952. The delivery of the 12 engines of the class was spread over no less than 38 years. The first engines built for the line when it opened as far as Coonoor in 1899 were these tiny 240s from Bayer Peacock in Manchester. The engineers had been overcautious in setting limits of size and weight, rendering these little engines almost useless for any serious work. When the line to Ooty was completed in 1909, the restrictions were lifted, and the North British Company in Glasgow delivered these sturdy 082s. They were powerful enough, but had mechanical problems with the almost inaccessible pinion drive. Not before time, the experts in Switzerland were consulted, and in 1914 they came up with these X-Class 082 locomotives, which proved perfectly suited to the job. Instead of hiding everything away out of sight, the Swiss placed the pinion drive on the outside of the locomotives, making life much easier for the fitters at Coonoor, who maintain them in top condition to this day. Waiting to leave now is the afternoon local to Ooty. Above Coonoor, the gradient eases back to 1 in 25. The rack and pinion is no longer required, so the locomotive can proceed in a more sprightly fashion, more akin to an ordinary train, although the engine is still placed at the back. The train now passes the former British military area, still an important barracks for the Indian Army, whose neat white bungalows dot the surrounding hillsides. Ketty and Lovedale, the landscape broadens out before the line reaches its highest point at 7,300 feet. The train descends to Ooty, which lies in a mountain hollow, surrounded by the Nilgiri peaks that rise to nearly 9,000 feet. To confuse the traveller, the town has now been officially renamed Udagamandala in deference to the regional Tamil dialect, though everyone still calls it Ooty. Certainly, nobody had heard of Udagamandala when these standard vanguard taxis were sent out to India. Coincidentally, they arrived in the same year as the last of the steam engines on the railway, and to this day parade neatly outside the station, waiting to take passengers down to the main street, which used to be called Charing Cross, or to the colourful local market. In the surrounding hills, the villas remain that once belonged to India's colonial masters. They used the railway to escape from the scorching heat and disease of the plains to the healthier climes of the Nilgiris, where the cool summers reminded an Englishman of home. The English place names all survived for many years in the railway timetable. This is the 1971 edition, in which the halts at Adderley and Runnymede look like quite important towns. But today's officials have little time for such nostalgia. The latest timetable makes no reference to Ooty at all, showing only the new name of Udagamandala, while Adderley and Runnymede have disappeared altogether, leaving just Hillgrove and Lovedale as relics of a British past. Other links with the past remain, such as the use of British-type Edmondson card railway tickets for the first-class passengers, who nowadays are not just Europeans, but Indians on holiday as well. The Nilgiris are very popular, too, with honeymoon couples, briefly exchanging the bustle and squalor of the big cities for the romantic charms of the Blue Mountain scenery, and the momentary discomfort of a smut in the eye for this young Indian bride. The railway has been running at a loss for several years now, and the Indian government wants to close it. So far, however, a vigorous local campaign to keep it open has been successful. The loss of this charming but eminently useful and practical relic of the Raj would be tragic indeed.
With a new two-tone gray paint scheme. The Union Pacific 8444 was the last steam locomotive purchased by the railroad and is from a group of 45 dependable 484s that were used in their passenger service. It was placed in service in 1944 and pulled the famous Overland Limited, Los Angeles Limited, Pacific Limited, Portland Rose and Challenger trains. It was originally built to burn coal, but in 1945 was converted to an oil burner. The locomotive has just been changed from an all-black paint scheme to a two-tone gray, which was common on these engines in the 40s. We have traveled to Cheyenne, Wyoming to share with you the Union Pacific 8444 with its new paint as it travels to Omaha and back. Then we'll also ride aboard the 8444's excursion from Denver to Laramie. It's precisely 9 a.m. on September 22nd as engineer Steve Lee gives two toots as the 8444 begins its departure from Cheyenne on Tuesday morning, headed for North Platte. The 84